In 1849, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill stimulated the gold rush in California that spilled over into Nevada as prospectors flocked into the territory in hopes of striking it rich. While many of the boom towns subsequently went bust, the state is dotted with a few small rural communities that are held together by a different type of gold in the form of social capital. Goodsprings, Nevada is one of these places. While Goodsprings has lost many of the physical features that existed during its peak, it has a group of past and present residents who maintain a connection with the town. Sociologists have studied the significance of social capital in small rural towns like Goodsprings. One theory is that the remaining residents have a resilience because of this type of linkage. Indeed, Goodsprings, Nevada is a place where generations maintain their links through groups like the old-timers, who are evidence of the strong bonds among the inhabitants. The history of this small town, located 35 miles away from the busy metropolis of Las Vegas, represents how part of the state of Nevada and the American West have changed over time. According to the political scientist Michael Bowers, one important theme in the history of the state of Nevada is man's interest in exploiting its resources. Mining towns that went boom and bust are an example of this ethos. Goodsprings is part of this history that was affected by political and economic events of the mid-19th century, such as the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave territory of the Southwest to the United States. The migration of the Mormon missionaries who in 1855 set up a mission in the Vegas Valley, and the discovery of gold in California. After the Comstock Lode is found, mining became an important issue in Nevada with the strikes in places such as Tonopah, Goldfield, and Rhyolite. When prospectors discovered rich ores at these places, the search for minerals spread to southern Nevada, where Native Americans discovered lead ore in the area known as Potosi. Brigham Young dispatched Mormon settlers who struggled in a hostile environment but extracted 9,000 pounds of ore before leaving in 1857. 4 years later, there was a silver strike in the old Mormon mine and a gold strike that revived interest in mining among prospectors who were attracted to El Dorado Canyon. It is here that there is the first reference to a man who later founded Goodsprings. Originally from North San Juan, California, he traveled to the canyon in 1861. Good was searching for a canyon where gold glittered all over. When his group arrived at the canyon, they found a glitter, but it was not all gold. The mine was full of fool's gold. Iron Pirate, the group made some mining claims. It is unknown if they proceed to mine any ore. In 1868, Joseph Good appears in a notation about a group of prospectors who were camping on the southern slopes of the Spring Mountains. The famed Nevada mining town named for this early prospector and cattleman was near this place. In 1882, S.E. Yount located a Keystone gold mine in the mountains west of Goodsprings, and he selected the springs as a site for a new mill to process the ores. The lack of trains meant that miners in Goodsprings, such as George Fail, moved ore by horse and wagon. Life was primitive in the camps at the time. Frank Williams described the way they lived by setting up tents, including ones that sold merchandise, on sites that buildings later occupied in the town. Goodsprings mining became official in 1901 when J.F. Kent founded the Yellow Pine Mining Company, located 4 miles west of Goodsprings. With the development of railroads in the area, mining in the Goodsprings area began to take off. In 1905, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railway was constructed and passed through the area. The last spike was set near Jean, which was initially called Goodsprings Junction. At this time, a mill was constructed in Goodsprings that could handle 100 tons of ore. The railroad was beneficial to the Yellow Pine Mining Companies and it enabled Kent to ship the ores at a lower cost. In order to get his shipments to the train depot in Jean, Kent decided to build a small railroad to take the ores from the mine to the mill, and then from the town to the depot. Constructing the railroad to the mine was not an easy task because there was a steep rise up to the mine. They lost equipment through accidents, including gasoline-powered locomotives and a shay. The Yellow Pine Mill was the only facility using water and doing wet milling in the area. By 1916, because of World War I and the demand for ore, there were 20 mines in the district with 400 employees, using different types of mining. Some used deep shafts and others used temporary openings. The work was done by hand and with a piston. It ran 24 hours a day at the cost of $1.46 per ton. The mine in the district were producing about 6,000 tons a month, with an average price of $65. At that time, investors shared in the profits through dividends on its stock. The Goodsprings Gazette marketed the mines to investors. Such advertisements were not only directed to locals, but they also appeared on newsstands in the East to attract investors. Jean Elizabeth Weir maintained a diary in 1908 that described life in and around these mining camps and boom towns. Dr. Weir was a history professor who traveled around the state observing and collecting documents and artifacts. In this diary, Dr. Weir explains the hardships of the environment, including problems with the extreme heat and the difficulties of traveling between the camps. In one passage, she related going between Nipton and Goodsprings.
Dressed under difficulties. No water in room, neither a mirror. Toilet had to be made beside the front door, where passerbys, as well as lodgers passing by, could gaze on the operation. Finished breakfast by 6:30 and rode in lumber wagon without springs to Nipton, 6 miles distant, where took train for Jean.
Dr. Weir also described the status of several of the mining boom towns, including Rhyolite, that had recently gone bust.
Rhyolite is quiet now, but has some fine buildings and gives evidence of past prosperity.
She also described traveling to and staying in Goodsprings.
Stayed at Mr. Yount's Hotel, an oasis in the desert. Everything clean and cheerful. Excellent meals and beautiful garden.
She included a reference to the mining operations in Goodsprings.
After dinner, we drove in moonlight to the Kent and Green Mountain mines. Wonderful production of lead and zinc.
At this point, there was much optimism about the future of the mining district. One mining engineer stated, "There seems to be plenty of ore in the site of the district, and mining and treatment conditions are not unfavorable. So the district will keep producing if there is a fair price." This prosperity overflowed into Goodsprings, and the town acquired many amenities. Some of the pioneer families replaced the tents with structures. George Fell, who had come from Calico, California in 1905 to help his uncle, Samuel Yount, operate general merchandising stores in Goodsprings, built many of these. The Fell family, Leonard Fell, is pictured here, built a hotel, a saloon, a cafe, and a general store. In 1916, the hotel was rebuilt, offering such luxuries as electricity, steam heat, and running water. Visitors came to the popular 20-room hotel in their Model T automobiles. It had a large ballroom and opening ceremonies, including a dance. The hotel had its heyday during this period through the 1920s, when it was known for having the best food in Clark County. The town also included a school, which began in the tent in 1907. Later, the school used a building which was replaced in 1913 with a one-room schoolhouse. The school had its ups and downs. During the boom time of 1916 to 17, it needed 2 teachers and a janitor. Later, when the money was tight, the school would open late or close early due to the lack of funds. The school ran with community participation. The heads of families were called together to vote on big decisions such as the building of the addition. The town had many activities. There were road rallies, oil drilling contests, parades, and burro rides. Here, Will Beckley stands in front of the clothing store that featured name brands items that people could find in the big cities like Florsheim shoes. However, two events changed the gala atmosphere of the town. The end of World War I decreased the demand for oars, and the Spanish flu spread throughout Goodsprings. During this pandemic, the hotel was converted to a whole hospital, and the town lost 3 men prominent in its development, including the merchant George Fail, the metal sayer Mr. Rowdy, and the manager of the Yellow Pine Mining Company, Fred Hale. According to the history researcher Gordon Russo, the flu killed Goodsprings. The pandemic changed the trajectory of the town through the loss of such men who may have the skills and the vision to keep the economic momentum going. During the mid-20s, ore quantities became too small and the peak of the mining activities for the Yellow Pine Mining Company ended. Activity ceased in 1926. During this period, there was also problems with fires that burned down the mill twice, and floods that washed out the railroad. By 1930, the railroad ceased operation and the equipment was salvaged. However, in 1936, the mine was reopened for a limited amount of activity. There was a brief uptick in mining during World War II, but by 1947, the war was over and the price of lead and zinc crashed and the mines closed. Fortunately, the inhabitants of Goodsprings were kept employed by a couple of the residents who started stone quarries near the base of Mount Potosi for flagstone and building stone. In addition, there was a company that was mining for rare earth metals on Mountain Pass, located about 40 miles south of Goodsprings. Despite any hardships caused by booms and busts of the economic situation during this period, the residents maintained their social links. Bill Hamilton, whose father was a chemist who worked with mining assays, lived in the town from 1941 to 1954. He relates the type of activities that the children and adults did in the town over a period that included World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. He tells stories of how they came together to view northern lights and to have snowball fights during a rare snowfall in the town. Also, his diary contains references to communal wartime activities such as air raid drills, scrap metal collecting, and atom bomb tests. He relates how he and his friends encountered Hollywood when they met Andy Devine, Dale Evans, and Roy Rogers, who were making a film near the town called The Bells of San Angelo. They were also aware of the presence of Clark Gable, who stopped and waited for news in the town regarding the tragic plane crash in the nearby mountains involving his wife, Carol Lombard. Likewise, he notes some of the social organizations such as churches, describing how a preacher would come into town for a summer Bible school, and he stated that all of us kids attended and we learned songs. We made little things to take home to our mothers. He noted that the big event was the Christmas program for the play. Everyone in the town came, 100%. In addition, he relates a story about a failed oil boom in 1945, when everybody thought they would become millionaires in Goodsprings. David Lowe, a childhood friend of Bill Hamilton, also provides insight into the sources of entertainment in Goodsprings during this period. In his memoir entitled The Goodsprings Hotel, he described how the facility, which is family-owned, encouraged social interactions of the town. In addition to serving as a dining room and bar, the hotel was a scene of dances, parties, political rallies, and community meetings. At dances, live musicians or jukeboxes provided a tempo. Lowe stated that the residents of Goodsprings would whirl on a dance floor together. Out-of-towners also provided entertainment at the hotel. There was a Las Vegas couple who liked to play Trivia Pursuit and political rallies for figures such as Senator Pat McCarran at the hotel. It also provided housing for some undesirables, such as a conman by the name of Dangerfield Jack, who came to town in order to exploit the failed oil exploration. Bobby Poole is another former resident who continued to interact with Goodsprings society, and likewise recalls the atomic bomb blasts that were a local spectacle. Shining through the classroom windows, the children would stand outside with special glasses protecting their eyes, with the mushroom cloud eclipsing Mount Potosi in the distance. It was a local spectacle, entertainment for children who were isolated. Steve Fleming, a current resident and the president of the Historical Society, recalls the freedom and the trust of the town.
I loved being able to go up into the hills. We were able to hike all the hills around Goodsprings. We were able to basically be on our own. Maybe there'd be a couple of friends of mine, and we would hike up to the top of the hill. It's to the south of town. And just the fact that you were able to kind of go wherever in the little town. Most everybody knew who everybody else was, so that if somebody were needed to find one of us, it was pretty easy, even though there wasn't a lot of phone service in town. But basically people knew, could identify us and tell my grandmother or my mother where I was. and we were escorted home if we needed to be, but we knew how to get home really fast.
Mickey Moran is another resident who has fond memories of her life in Goodsprings as a child. She recalls other incidents that brought the community together, like the time when the circus came to town. At that time, her family ran the Goodsprings Hotel, and members of the circus stopped to stay. Community residents had a great time being entertained by the elephants and the ponies in the circus. The term social capital has roots in the late 19th century, when sociologists such as Emil Durkheim created theories about the impact of industrialization on Western society that was changing from agriculture to industry during the Industrial Revolution. Robert Putnam, a 21st century sociologist, commented on the distinctive meaning of the phrase when he wrote, "While physical capital refers to physical objects and human capital refers to the properties of individuals, social capital refers to connection among individuals." These include social networks and the norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them. He connected this capital with civic virtue, that the strongest when it is inside this type of network. There are different ways of looking at this phenomenon. In 1916, L.J. Hannafin, a state supervisor for rural schools in West Virginia, employed the phrase when she was concerned that schools in rural districts where people lived spread apart did not have the same support as schools in urban districts where people lived closer together and were more socially linked. In the 1950s, Canadian sociologists used the term to describe the way that people in the suburbs joined group activities like bridge clubs. In the 1960s, Jane Jacobs, an urbanist, came up with a theory about the way that neighbors in modern cities supported each other. There are many different manifestations of social capital. Usually, official membership in formal organizations is regarded as a sign of such involvement. Alexis de Tocqueville commented about such organizations in America in the 19th century, where he visited a new democratic nation and noted that Americans of all stages, all stations in life, all types of disposition are forever forming associations. Currently, American voluntary associations include community-based, church-based, and work-based. Sociologists such as Putnam, who wrote a book called Bowling Alone, claim that social capital may be declining due to the reduction in regular contact with friends and neighbors in contemporary society. These researchers have a theory that social capital is multidimensional. They use the term interpersonal trust among the residents and look at a number of different variables that may affect social capital, including length of time of residence, number of social organizations in town, and voluntary participation in them. What about the role of work with social capital? Declining rural areas have challenges with economics. One option for moribund or declining places is tourism. However, as the historian Hal Rothman noted, tourism is a devil's bargain since it is divisive. Usually, it only benefits the groups such as developers who make money on projects which change the nature of the place and displace social bonds. Today, social capital is cultivated among the residents of Goodsprings in a number of different ways. The unincorporated town has a council, the Community Action Committee that meets at the end of each month in the community center. The minutes indicate that the committee discusses issues that impact the life of a community, such as applications for commercial uses near Goodsprings, and assists with activities like cleanup days. Another volunteer group that works for the good of the community is the Goodsprings Historical Society, which numbers about 200 members. According to Steve Fleming, the current president of the Historical Society, the group came together.
We started the Historical Society in 2001. So we basically, our idea was to preserve the history of the community and the surrounding areas, and to try to share that history with other people so that it can be preserved.
Besides collecting information about the past, it also concentrates on the present.
My idea on historic preservation is that history can be preserved where it occurred. I think it has a more meaning if you see a little building and you can say that building has been there for 100 years. The Clark County Museum has done a wonderful job relocating a lot of old buildings, but when you're at that facility or that location, you can't really relate to exactly where it was when it was actually being used.
For example, it has stepped in when there was an ownership issue about the cemetery.
A fellow purchased the adjacent property and actually thought that he also was purchasing the cemetery, which anyway, we were able to get the district attorney to investigate how the exchange of property was, because it was basically given to the community by the Robbins family, which was an old mining family. The place is still here, though none of the family is here, but they gave that property to be used for bona fide residents of the town of Goodsprings.
Members also bring up other issues at meetings, such when the owner of a local radio station discussed ways to help with public safety through linking the community with hand radios. Likewise, the volunteer fire department not only contributes to the safety of the community, which has experienced major fires in the past, but also establishes links with residents of the town through showcasing equipment at social gatherings and exhibiting community pride at the annual Clark County Parade. The group's organizer, Colleen Hicks, is in charge of recruiting staff and is the contact person for permission to use the community center. An additional link between the fire department and the residents is that members of the community run a small thrift shop to support the fire department. Evidence of the social links included turnouts at events like the Old Timers Reunion. According to Steve Fleming, it has been an important tradition.
It was a very special town. This year will be the 37th Goodsprings reunion. That started with a group of classmates of my mother. The kids that lived here grew up in Goodsprings, of course, went to high school at Las Vegas High School. They were having a reunion there, and a number of the kids that had grown up together in Goodsprings said, we should have a Goodsprings reunion. So 37 years ago, they started one, and those first reunions, the whole field in front of the school, it was kind of what we use now as a parking lot. It was actually our baseball field when I was a kid. And that parking lot would be full of recreation vehicles because they came from Washington, Texas, wherever any of the people that had lived here had moved to. And it was unbelievable how great it was. And we were very lucky that Julie, our teacher at the time, Julie Newberry, really took an interest in the history, and has compiled a history that I would put it up against any history of any school in the country, and it's available during that reunion weekend all the time. So we became part of it as our Goodsprings Historical Society a few years later. So we were very lucky to piggyback on to the history that they were gathering, and that's why we have a quite remarkable photographic collection and some interviews that we've done through the years.
It is another important source for collecting the history of the links over time.
In the 80s, I found out that in the month of May, that Goodsprings had a reunion of people who used to live in Goodsprings. We're talking about as early as the teens, the 20s, the 30s, and that these people would come on a weekend. So I decided to try it one time, and I was just excited to meet some of these people who maybe went to the school in 1920 or such. And I decided that I wanted to start collecting their stories and their pictures or whatever they had that they were willing to give me. And they were just thrilled to have me take them, and knowing that I would keep the history of the school going.
Another event that brings out the town is the craft fair, which includes multiple generations. Relative newcomers who did not have extensive links with the town also point to community traditions that tie residents together. Frank Bellin moved to the town in 1992 after discovering accidentally.
I first found the place. My roommate at the time and I were camping over here at the base of Mount Potosi. And I said, instead of going back to town, let's take this dirt road and see where it goes after we broke camp. And we came into the town here, and I told Gary, I said, this has to be Goodsprings. I had never been up here before, but I said, this has to be Goodsprings. And then as we came into town, one of the first places I saw was this place. And at the time, it was all painted red. And it looked like just an old farmhouse, farm place, like where I grew up in Ohio. And the moment I saw it, I told Gary, I said, I want to live there. I want to buy that place. And sure enough, I mentioned Mickey Moran before, but Mickey was my boss at the time. And a year later, she mentioned to me that the people that lived here were trying to sell it forever. So I came up, and a month later, I bought it.
Bellin stated that he has been active with social groups like the Historical Society, but one of his favorite social activities happened in the late 90s at the Pioneer Saloon.
And we used to have dart tournaments every Friday night, and that's where half the town got together for those dart tournaments, and it was a lot of fun.
In addition, the community is very attached to the schoolhouse, which has been built in 1913. It has been an important center of community activity, as shown here with this image of the class of 1929. Julie Newman, who taught at the school for 16 years in the 80s and 90s, now notes how generations have grown up ringing the school bell in Goodsprings.
There were several families where like a parent went to the school, and later on their children went to the school, because there were families that just stayed in Goodsprings for a long time. There was one family that I ended up having a great-grandson, and looking back at all of the members of that family, there were 4 generations that actually had a child go to Goodsprings School.
Mrs. Newman states that 9 decades of old report cards and class lists she has collected could double as genealogy charts for the town. Steve Fleming is a current resident whose roots go way back.
My grandfather came to Goodsprings in 1912. My grandmother came in 1916. They were actually married right down on Spring Street, downtown Goodsprings.
And include the popular school teacher, Ed Fleming.
He graduated from St. John's University in Minnesota, Collegeville, Minnesota. Came out and visited his sister who was the oldest sister in the family, she was teaching in Pahrump. And this was in the 30s. Basically, he loved it when he visited with his brother. And the next year, he was going to graduate, and my aunt was going to be leaving the Pahrump school. So basically, she said, Edmund, do you think you would like to teach out in Pahrump? So he came from Collegeville, Minnesota to Pahrump, taught school, and then taught in Nelson, Nevada also, and then came to Goodsprings and taught in Goodsprings for 5 years.
Mickey Moran was a student of his.
But my fondest memories of Goodsprings are attending the school, and especially the 5th and 6th grades with Ed Fleming. He was a marvelous teacher, and what I learned in the 5th and 6th grade carried me through the 7th and 8th grade, and just unbelievable, and was an influence on my entire life.
Mrs. Newberry notes that this tradition affects the community, claiming that the students develop a real sense of pride in the school, a real sense of family, because in many cases they are family. It continues to play an important role in the community today, as illustrated by the inclusion of the students in the Old Timers Reunion festivities. During a recent reunion, past students lingered in the schoolyard and shared memories. Inside the schoolhouse, this group of old-timers enjoyed the performance of the current students who sang songs about Nevada and were awarded for the knowledge of the American Constitution in a very special ceremony. Members of the community rallied around the school to keep it open when it was threatened with closure in 2009.
We were about as vocal as anybody could be at every school board meeting, and basically shared the information that corrected many of the terrible errors that were part of the reason that they gave for closing the school. Their budget was incredibly inaccurate. We were fortunate also to have a trustee, Carolyn Edwards, who went to bat for us too, and said, that school should not close.
Likewise, Julie Newman describes how this group affected the school board.
The school district had picked 2 of our schools that they thought maybe they could close. Ours was one of them, and the one up in Mount Charleston also was the other. Well, all of us really got together and we presented ourselves to the school board on one of their meetings, and we each gave a speech, and some of the others on our board gave a speech. And one member of the school board, told me later is when I showed them a picture of the bell on the roof, that really touched her heart.
At that time, to save the school, they developed a plan to increase the school's population with children from the nearby community. Another aspect that unites the community is the library, which has a high circulation rate. The librarian maintains an announcement board with notifications for community activities like garden clubs. One aspect that does not connect to resident in current-day Goodsprings is employment. Obviously, the people first came to Goodsprings for employment. However, today, there are not a lot of jobs in Goodsprings. While nearby Las Vegas thrives on tourism, residents of Goodsprings do not appear interested in having that type of economy in town. However, residents are not opposed to opening a town to visitors who will respect it and have developed a project based on their history.
The trail that they're talking about, years ago, about 2006, across the country, they were looking at the old railroad trails, and they were developing trails along those old railroad spots. So we got involved way back in 2006, and we've still worked on it to be able to have the money to build a trail on the railroad that this traveled.
The project runs 2.4 miles around the perimeter of the town, following the path of the Yellow Pine Railroad from the mill. At this point, Residents are concerned about the need for visitors to maintain respect for the town.
Why to keep it's a non-motorized trail to keep motorized vehicles off of our hills surrounding us. We've always asked for at least a mile perimeter. What we have to do as a town now is also assure that it is monitored a bit, so that if you have some people that disrespect everything, that we let the proper people make them aware of what is happening. So it's not just doesn't just show up and somebody else has to take care of it. We're going to have some responsibility too.
Yeah. Indeed, this concern prompted members of the community to come together to push back attempts by the historic Pioneer Saloon to expand by building a hotel after it was added to the State Register of Historic Places in 2007. One issue was the availability of groundwater that the residents of the town depend on. They also have issues with commercial interests that try to capitalize on the town's past by constructing narrators about Goodsprings' haunted streets, abandoned buildings, and cemetery, and bring tourists into areas that residents of Goodsprings considered sacred. The Goodsprings Historical Society tries to assist with this task.
The Historical Society kind of looks after everything that has history in the town. There are several of them that live there, especially, that look after the cemetery. There is a problem nowadays with busloads coming into Goodsprings, and so we are trying to develop ways that we can keep them out of the cemetery unless they have a reason to be there. So we're still working on that. That's a more recent problem we have. There have been people in the past who are no longer with us that have been very, very involved with watching out for that cemetery. We do have a few buildings in town too that we keep track of and watch because they are very old.
As Goodsprings moves further into the 21st century, the lives of the residents are bound together by traditions started over 100 years ago. While early residents were united in their quest for valuable minerals like gold, the current residents are linked by something more intangible. Residents mine a different type of gold through their long-lasting bonds, and it is the social capital that has contributed to the endurance of the town. As can be seen in social groups like garden clubs and historical societies, community organizations contribute to this network. Likewise, support for institutions like the 100-year-old schoolhouse exhibit the strength of these links. At the same time, they work together to create new associations and traditions extending beyond the community, like the Yellow Pine Railroad walking trail. Unlike the isolated members of contemporary society cited by the sociologist Robert Putnam, Goodsprings residents are not bowling alone. Rather, as other sociologists, such as Robert Withnow, who studied rural communities in America's heartland, state, communities like Goodsprings are bound together by multi-dimensional factors. Goodsprings is a place where multiple generations have lived, where members of the community are on their first name basis and work together for common goals, including the preservation of the rural community. The past is present in Goodsprings with the annual reunion of the old-timers who congregate in a place that seems far from the hustle and bustle of the Las Vegas metro area of the north. Who knows what the future will bring? But for now, Goodsprings reaps the benefits of their special brand of social gold.